Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Late Season Grazing, What You Need to Know to Extend Your Grazing Season. I'm Kelsey Virgin. I'm a project manager with the Pasture Project at the Wallace Center, who is hosting this webinar today, along with Danny Heisler from Valley Stewardship Network. To start us off, I'm first going to go over some logistics for the webinar today. I'll talk briefly about the Pasture Project and Valley Stewardship Network and our partnership. Then we'll do some audience polling where some questions will appear on your screen. After that, we'll get into our presentation, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. In terms of the Zoom technology, I think we're all probably pretty familiar with it at this point, but we do ask that you keep yourselves muted during the presentation, but you should feel free to put your questions in the chat box as you have them. However, we will wait till the end of the presentation to address them. If you're having technical difficulties, also feel free to put those questions in the chat box and we'll do what we can to help you out. Please note that there is a short survey, follow-up survey at the end of the webinar. Please take a moment to complete this. It really helps us as we develop future webinars. And then a note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Pasture Project YouTube channel in the coming week. All right, we're gonna get into some introductions. The Pasture Project is part of the Resilient Agriculture and Ecosystems Initiative of the Wallace Center at Winrock International. Pasture Project works to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest, and specifically in a 6-state region in the upper Mississippi River Basin, although we do work with some national audiences. Valley Stewardship Network, or VSN, works to protect land and water through research, education, and community involvement in the Kickapoo and neighboring watersheds in Wisconsin. VSN provides educational resources, workshops, and conservation assessments to increase farm BMPs for watershed stewardship. VSN also facilitates the formation and support activities of farmer-led watershed councils. Pasture Project and VSN, along with the Tanner Creek Farmer-Led Watershed Council, have partnered together to form the Tanner Creek Grazing Project. This 3-year project provides grazing resources and education to support regenerative grazing in the watershed. The project goal is to work with farmers and landowners in the watershed to directly reduce nutrient and sediment loss through the adoption of regenerative grazing practices. Examples of supported practices include conversion of cropland to pasture, transition from continuous to rotational grazing, and the use of cover crops as forage. And this webinar series is part of our education and outreach efforts. Please visit our websites or contact us for more information about our work and to stay up to date on future webinars. So Arin Crooks is the superintendent of the UW-Madison Lancaster Agricultural Research Station located in the Driftless region of Southwest Wisconsin. He oversees the 530-acre research facility for the UW-Madison College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and assists researchers that carry out approximately 40 different research projects annually. Specifically, Arin oversees the daily care and research with the 120-head commercial Angus beef cow herd. The herd is rotationally grazed, and beef research project areas include genetics, grazing, nutrition, and reproduction. Arin began at Lancaster ARS in 1999 as the assistant superintendent after earning bachelor's and master's degrees in animal science from UW-Madison. In 2013, he assumed the superintendent role and oversees all of the agronomy, beef, and general station management. So thank you, Arin, for being willing to present today and share your expertise with us all. I'm gonna hand it off to you.
Alrighty. Well, thank you. I'll get my screen shared here. All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Kelsey, and Danny for the invite with the Pasture Project and Valley Stewardship Network for inviting me to speak today on late season grazing, what you need to know to extend your grazing season. So I'm going to preface this with, as Kelsey said, my background is in animal science and kind of management of cattle. So I'm not an agronomist, so I'm not the best on soil fertility and variety selection, things like that. But through the years of being here, I'd like to say I'm experienced. My kids will call me old. My mother-in-law calls me unique, which I think that's a good thing, but she just meant that's unique that I've been at one place for 20 years doing the same type of job, but I enjoy it. It's interesting. Give you a little background and introduction to the station and what I do, and then we'll move into our topic and discuss some things on different forages that we can extend our season with. So we are a satellite facility, as has been said, with UW-Madison and the CALs. We're one of 12 different research stations around the state that help serve the CALs researchers. So how we kind of operate is the researchers are located on the UW-Madison campus. And so we carry out daily research for those. So the researcher will come to us and say, hey, we've got a project we'd like to do with cover crops. Would you have the area and ability, or could we graze them with the cows? How's that work? And we'll figure out how to get it done. And so they'll come with the ideas and be the supervisors of the project, and we'll do the daily care of it. So, but it's kind of a two-way street. They rely on us. If we get an idea for a project, we can relay back to them from producers. If producers don't contact them directly. So we try to be as applied as we can and useful for the people surrounding us. So in our area for the research station at Lancaster is primarily beef, grazing, and the agronomy areas. We'll branch out a little bit in some others, but those are our main focus areas. And then for our area, the driftless region that we're all in here in Southwest Wisconsin and surrounding areas in Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois, that's where we're most specifically for. So here's a general map of Wisconsin with all the different research stations. A lot of people have heard the Arlington station, North Madison. We are the farthest southwest station, but they stretch all the way up to Spooner, where they do some crops and horticulture. Camp up there by Minocqua in the top, that's a natural resources and forestry station, all the way over to the Door County, where Peninsula and the station that they do apples and cherries and things like that. Rhinelander and Hancock work a lot with potatoes and other vegetable production. Rhinelander up in northern Wisconsin, they do a potato breeding project where they develop new varieties, and Hancock and the Central Sands is where they do a lot of vegetable and crop production under irrigation. Marshfield in the center part of the state is a valuable station for that area, and those muck soils, wet heavy soils for crops, as well as Marshfield also has a dairy that cooperates with Arlington and the dairy herd that they have there. And Arlington, in addition to the 500 cow dairy, they also have a beef feedlot, swine herd, a sheep flock, and lots of different crop projects that go on there. There's some other stations that located closer to Madison. They're more specialized. And the last one I'll talk about is the Dairy Forage Research Center. That's part joint with USDA and their Ag Research Service, where they milk 350, 400 cows, something like that, and everything related to forages and dairy production. So whether that's alfalfa, grasses, corn silage, cover crops, grazing, you name it, as it relates to dairy production, that's what they work with. So why would the state need that many different research stations? And I'm not a soil scientist, but I can appreciate this chart here, map with all the different colors. As you can see, kind of that pinkish purple and some of that yellow covers the driftless region. That's us in Southwest Wisconsin, but that's different from the deep prairie soils that you might find in South Central, Southeastern Wisconsin. Move up into that Northeast, into some of the other karst region and Door County. Those soils are different as compared to the Central Sands or the muck soils that I talked about around Marshfield, and up into the timber soils into the northern part of the state. So however, whatever project we're working on, if there's multiple sites, how it works out for us here versus what it works out in the prairies in Arlington or the muck soils at Marshfield, it all might take a little bit different, or the climate change is a little bit different when you get up towards Spooner and in those areas versus what it might be in the farther south in the state. So a little more about the station itself. We started in 1963, and we are actually in cooperation ourselves, and we started with USDA Ag Research Service. They had a soil conservation, soil erosion facility farm up by La Crosse near Granddad's Bluff, and some of you might be familiar with that. That's in the area, but they worked in that area and that facility, I believe in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, and USDA decided they wanted to change in direction a little bit and focus, so they moved their operations down here for a few years when the station was formed. And as it turned out, they changed their focus again and moved on to another location leaving the UW here. So that's when we added the beef cattle, herd of Hereford and Angus cows, cow-calf at the time, and started the operations that we complete operations that we do now, I should say. So our focus and mission has always been conserving soil and the seep terrains of our area. I always say when we have groups of people visit that it's we were sustainable before sustainable was ever a buzzword and cool, and now regenerative agriculture is the buzzword. But I think whether it's conservation or sustainability or regenerative, it's all fits together of what do we have to do to maintain our soil and our environment. In us, with the steep terrains that we have, is a little bit different than what they do in the prairies and some other flatter areas or other areas of the state and country. But that's always been our focus, and whether that's utilizing no-till or conservation tillage, forages, grazing, the contour strips around the hillsides, and mixing the forage in with soil erosion. We got to keep that soil in place so we don't let it run down the hillside in those big rain events and get to the streams in the river and end up in the Gulf of Mexico. So our little claim to fame is we're the only university-based research station in the Driftless region. We so for Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, all those states, they don't have a research station for the universities in this area. So we've always maintained an interest of not only from researchers that might want to do a research project here from time to time, but also from the surrounding farmers. So whether it's somebody across into Minnesota a little bit, or around the area, Dubuque area, across the river from us down here in Grant County, or down south of the state line in northwestern Illinois, those farmers can look to us and have a lot more familiarity and similarities for them versus what they might find at Iowa State at Ames, or up in Minneapolis or Urbana, Champaign, where they're the deep flat prairie soils that don't really resemble what we have around here. So as was said, we have 40 to 50 different research projects annually. Typically those are 2 to 3 year projects in length. Some of them are only a year, and some of them stretch, can be longer, and we'll talk about one of those later here a little bit. And as was said, we have 530 total acres. We have about 220 acres of crops and 200 acres of pasture. And again, our main research area is kind of agronomic crops, conservation, beef, and grazing is what our main focus are. This picture here, I think, kind of sums up our facility all in pretty well one shot. In the bottom and the low area, there's a pasture, and we've got our cows and calves grazing, and we've got a alfalfa hay strip that we're making as hay above that, and alternating row crops above that. And on the top, you can kind of see the staggered individual plots of some corn and some other research plots. So it kind of fits everything that we do all in one shot. So in addition to our research, we also have outreach as part of our mission. And that is myself giving talks like this when they arise, as well as hosting field days. We usually do 2 to 3 a year if we can. COVID has kind of put a monkey wrench in some of those things, but we're trying to get back to our normal, or our new normal as the case may be. We'll host sometimes trainings in schools for whether it's farmers or professionals. We did grazing schools in the past, as well as different ones. We'll host tours for classes, whether that's high school or colleges, producers, professionals, and we'll try to accommodate as much as possible. If we get a visitor that stops in to learn more about what we do, we'll try to share and all the knowledge that we have and let them see what we're doing. So we've also been a home office for regional and state UW extension agents. So nutrient pest management agents have had their office here from time to time, and maybe most familiar for some of the people in this group would be Rhonda Gildersleeve. That was the state grazing specialist for UW extension, was housed here up until she retired here a few years ago. So, and beyond our outreach, we also collect weather data for the National Weather Service, and also last year put in a new weather station that's connected with a network from Wisconsin and Michigan that's providing all sorts of data online for anybody that wants to access it. So really with the station, we have a dual function. Part of it is the research and part of it is production. So as We crop acres, about a third of the crop acres are in research, and the other 2/3 go either in rotation or producing feed for the cattle herd. And beef cattle may only have one aspect for research. So right now our cow herd predominantly is all involved in a genetics and reproduction type project. But how we manage the cows during the winter and how we feed them or how we graze them during the summer really doesn't have any impact for the research project. So we do that as kind of common management, more like how somebody normally would do. So I always tell our student interns when they start in the summer, I said, some of the things that we'll do looks a lot like how you might have seen another farm at home or down the road have done. And for the research, sometimes we do things kind of peculiar and interesting, but we have to do it that way. There's a justification for that. So when we have differences, we can guarantee that they're what the variations that we want to find from the treatments and not some random causes that are causing those changes that we're seeing. So I have a few pictures of a virtual tour. So here's our office building, aerial shot of the farm. We're a little prettier with it, more green and growing. In the foreground there, when the station was purchased, was 2 farms. So in the foreground of the picture, you can see our office building and the other headquarters area that we have, some other shop and storage areas, and then in the back, kind of the pole shed building with the 2 silos. That's our main beef structure, and there's our cattle working facilities. So there's a closer shot of that building, and we have 8 different pens within that and a fence line feed bunk on the inside. So when we do rotational, we do nutrition, there's a shot. Nutritional studies or other management type studies, we can have smaller groups where normally you might have 1 or 2 pens in a 200-foot long building like that. We have 8, so we can have more divisions and little tighter management with it. So here's a study that's one of our probably most noteworthy. Shortly after we started in the 60s, we had a crop rotation study that began that looked at different crop rotations and its impact on corn yield and nitrogen fertilization on corn and its yield with the different crop rotations. And then interesting enough, in the 60s, it was looked at as maybe a way that what management we could do to eliminate alfalfa hay crops from a rotation if there's a farmer that wanted just to raise row crops. So they started and developed these rotations and started following them and measuring data. And along came, at that time, fertilizer was really cheap, but you got into the 70s and all of a sudden oil price and gasoline, the oil embargoes and fertilizer price therefore went really high for nitrogen. And all of a sudden they looked at the study and they said, well, wait a minute, we've got this perfect setup. We can study and try to find out what benefits, maybe we want the legumes in that rotation for nitrogen credit from the alfalfa or soybeans or there's other benefits we should look into. So they kind of did a 180 and started looking at the different rotations and the beneficial impacts versus going monoculture or minimizing the crops in the rotation. So, but this is carried on for over 50 years. So it's actually the 2nd oldest project in the country of its like. The oldest one is in Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. That's kind of a demonstration project where they don't really collect any data. They just have the rotations that they've maintained since, I believe it's the late 50s for that one down there. But this one is the oldest where we collect data. So there's kind of different small projects within scope that come and go that we'll look at, but the general crop rotations, the initial ones have gone back all the way over 50 years to the mid 60s. And here's a part of the current project that we're in. We're one of the many sites in the Midwest where they're looking at corn and trying to be as sustainable as they can with that and improving soil and maintaining. So throughout the whole Midwest, they have all these different sites, and we're one of 3 sites in Wisconsin that are participating in a larger regional project. So our windmill, as we always call it here, is not necessarily very noteworthy itself, but it's just the area where we do our calving and weaning. So people in the area are as familiar because it sits right along Highway 35 and 81. We'll do our calving, our adult cows, mature cows calve in April and June out there, and then graze 1 or 2 times during the summer and stockpile that pasture And here's a shot of wean calves from a few years ago, grazing some stockpiled pasture while we pasture weaned and fence line weaned to try to minimize the stress as much as we could on those calves to keep them growing and productive as possible. Here's another feedlot mound that we call it, that we winter some cattle on that structure. It's similar to what you'd have in Nebraska or Kansas or Oklahoma as feedlot mounds, but we use it just for a winter area where we can feed on that fence line bunk and the cement pad for the cattle to stand, and use that clay-based mound to get out of the weather and the mud that we have this time of year. But we have typically maintained our younger cows, first and second cows there, and then we'll put our older cows out in the crop fields where we'll graze some crop residue and other cover crops and things, and they can winter down in the woods, and then we can either feed some silage or hay as needed. So within our crops, as I said, we go corn, soybeans, small grains, alfalfa, and a variety of other forages as research interest goes. We're a site for different crop variety trials and are home to our long-term crop rotation study. And we'll do research with tillage, forages, herbicides, whatever. And then the top right picture was one of the first projects with cover crops that we did that I was here probably 15 plus years ago, where there was some interest. So we grew some different mixtures and varieties and took some yield and quality data, and then had a little field day where farmers could come in and actually see what was growing, so if they could decide if it was a good fit for them or not. So other crop research, the bottom left picture there is cure clover, and that is a cousin to red clover and white clover. And that is very hardy once it gets established. And actually, we did some research where you band sprayed some Roundup, and then you can no-till corn in there and then harvest that as corn silage or corn grain. That's a living mulch, they called it. And that top right-hand kitty quarter from that, the top right-hand picture, there's some plots for water runoff within those rectangular squares. The upper closer one is just straight corn silage with no cover crop, and I had the cure clover interseeded with the corn on the others, and we're comparing that. The top left is a little cedar seeding a forage type plot or small grains plot, and the contraption on the bottom right is one of those unique things you probably wouldn't see unless you're doing research, and that is actually a one row corn silage chopper testing for corn variety trial for silage, where they would chop that one row, blow it into that square hopper behind the tractor that had electronic scale so they could weigh. And then it was a little bit waste of the feed, but easiest for the management operation. They would just dribble that corn silage out on the ground behind the tractor once they collected their data. But it was a rather small plot, so it wasn't a lot of waste of forage, but kind of an interesting contraption that they had. Another top left is our rotation study, and even though we've got a lot of technology, sometimes it's just like at home on the farm. You got some other handwork of hoeing alleys and making right lengths for the plots. The bottom left is actually interseeding some cover crops into standing corn. We removed some gangs from the drill, no-till drill, and seeded into vegetative growth in the corn, short height corn. Top right is baleage and baled wrap studies. We did a number of those with Dan Undersander when he's at the UW and some local custom operators. And that's a pollination bee pollinator plot that we have as one of the projects at the station as well. On the cows, again, I have 120 cows calved shortly here in April through June. We do additional replacement heifers and other feeder cattle that will graze, and different areas of projects that we've handled through the years, anywhere from nutrition, genetics, reproduction, management, grazing, you name it. Some pictures of the cows. Bottom left is an embryo transfer project. Top right is actually some cows grazing a wooded area and a civil pasture project. We've got a couple of those. Bottom right is Holstein steers that not quite as common now, but had been, and we use those for grazing feedlot to answer different questions. So I'll roll through these quick so we have some time for our main slides. Cattle work, grazing work. The top left is teff grass. The top right is measuring pasture yield of with a rising plate meter. The bottom left is sorghum Sudan grass. We're had some grazing projects with that, and they're measuring height and taking pasture samples of some of our students. And kaolin feed bunks, where specialized feed bunks, were able to individually feed animals from each other on the pasture, so we could see the benefits of different supplemented feeds. We did a number of different projects through the years with Holstein steers and beef steers and growing cattle and even pasture finished cattle. So our field days, a couple of flyers for those, some pictures. So just like you'd have a pasture walk in the summer, the benefit for us of having a field day is we can, in the bottom left, we can talk about it if we want in the classroom and explain things, or we can go straight out to the field or the pasture and see what we're talking about, and what results we've had of whatever. Top ones, I think, have been a different weeds project, and we were talking about fence line weeding and cattle management down there in the bottom right. Mentioned our interns. I'll put a plug for them because that's this time of year. I've been doing interviews and we're trying to get those hired for the summer. We have 3 annual summer internships for college kids, two that work with cattle and one that is crops related. We have an annual position that cooperates with Southwest Tech College in Fenimore in their ag program, and the other 2 are open to any other students. For 4 year, we get not only UW-Madison, but a lot from UW-Platteville, UW-River Falls, even Iowa State, and others. So, all righty. So that's kind of the background of where I come from, and we'll move on for the rest of the presentation. So, extended grazing, or farmers are having interest in farm, and I thought this was fitting for the kind of weather that we've had in Wisconsin lately. Is when they ask you what kind of farm you have, you can say we all have a mud. We have mud farm. Hopefully we move on and get past and get on to green and growing in a lot better conditions, but it's kind of been a long spring or late winter, however you want to look at it. So benefits of extending the grazing season. Some of these are kind of obvious, but good to think about while you're going through the process. We'd hope that we can lower our feed cost if we don't have to feed that stored feed, and we can let the cattle or other animals graze it themselves. We can allow those animals to stay out on pasture conditions, so we lead less bedding and other confinement housing and expenses with that. If we do it right, we should be able to reduce our labor, let the animals do the work and not as much ourselves. And maybe we can make use of an otherwise wasted resource. So thinking about crop residues, excuse me, corn stalks, soybeans, stubble, whatever. If you have a neighbor or you have land that you're not going to harvest the residue, you can let the animals take some of that and they can get nutritional benefit out of that. And if you do it right, you don't have much impact or no negative impacts on the crop or the future crop yield. So besides the fact with cover crops, you can get the environmental benefits of reducing soil erosion, busting up soil compaction, building your soil fertility structure, all the good stuff that comes along with that. And if you have something where you need to renovate some pasture, if you had a sacrificial area, or you can blend in some annual crops in with another cropping system, you can be a little more efficient or help process the purpose. All right, so what are some options that we can do for extending grazing? Well, probably the simplest is you can manage your pastures and try to stockpile some pastures to graze further into the fall. You can utilize your crop residues, as we said, corn stalks or others. You can wait till after frost and graze some dormant alfalfa or hay ground. You can get into the annuals, maybe brassicas, which are turnips, rape, radishes, all that class. Small grains, oats is a common one, but you could be rye or any number of others. Grasses, and that's kind of a broad category, but maybe annual ryegrass, a warm season teff grass, even grazing corn plants themselves or sorghum Sudan grass. Legumes, it could be clover, vetch, and there's lots of others that can be mixed into different mixtures and be utilized. Maybe you get into a biennial grain or a winter rye, winter wheat, triticale, something like that. That's used a lot more in other parts of the country, but there's still some opportunities here to use them. And I'll cover a little bit at the end here about a perennial wheat. That's a kind of a unique small grain, perennial small grain or intermediate wheatgrass or kernza that we've worked with in the last few years. So if our normal grazing season is maybe May through October, when we talk about extending the grazing season, but there's some different options. Typically, we think about adding on to the end, so in the yellow and putting on November, December, but maybe you plant a winter rye or something like that, or stockpile and try to extend, get out a little earlier in April, give yourself a few weeks or a month. Or maybe you plant some of those other annuals we talk about, or something that you can supplement in your pastures and rest your other pastures, allow your normal pastures to rest somewhere between July and August or somewhere in there, and your other pastures grow up, so then you can extend them later into the season. So we've got options. So what's some risks or some things, other things to think about? Well, we're going to need some extra land. Do we have that? Is that land that we own, or do we need to rent additional land? What's the cost of that going to be? As well as how easy is it for the animals going to access that? Is it right next to our pastures, or is it 5 miles down the road? Things to think about. Timing sensitive. By that I mean, sometimes you got to get things planted in a certain window. You've got to graze them in a certain window. You've got to worry about frost and when that's going to come. So you got to have a little better management. Weather impacts. We can have the best laid plans, and just like we got mud now, we've had years where we get a lot of heavy rain in November, December, or we get really bad cold snap where you get way below zero, and that can mess up your plans for efficiency of grazing or taking water to them or whatever it might be on those areas. So, and we'll have extra effort to get the planting and the grazing done. So we'll need to buy some extra seed, have some different equipment to do the planting, or hire somebody to do it for us. We got to do more fertilization, buy more fertilizer. And as I said, you might have to add some fencing and water access, temporary or permanent, to be able to get all that done. Kind of continued, you also have to worry about meeting the nutritional needs of the animals grazing. That's your hay supplemental feed, maybe more expensive, but it's kind of easy. That your average hay is probably going to meet, what it's going to take to meet your needs, and there's not many toxicities or other things to worry about for your animals. So, but you start different crops, you have to think about, does it have enough protein? Does it have enough energy? Is there a fiber enough? Some of those plants can be really high quality, that can be too good a quality for what you need. And then also you start grazing legumes, if it's not frosted, you could get bloat. There's certain crops, nitrates, prussic acid, other poison things that can trouble, and you hate to have anything that would cause you to lose any animals to that. So as I said before there, with added fencing and water access, is it permanent? Is it temporary? Is it cold tolerant? Nobody likes to break ice out of water tanks, but we're no different. We've had to do that with projects when the weather hasn't cooperated too here. So, and then also, if you get adverse weather events, a lot of rain or something like that, maybe you got to worry about compaction. Or if you're grazing dormant hay fields and you get 3 inches of rain while the cows are out on it, maybe that'll kill out some of those plants. That's something you got to risk versus reward and think about. And overall, a lot of different things that I've looked through and said, and it's probably true that you need to have a backup plan for adverse conditions. So if you have a plan, but you get a foot of snow, maybe you got to delay your grazing, you got to have extra hay, or maybe you don't get out there and get it at all. So just some things to keep in mind while you're doing it. So kind of on the animal side of things, the animal impacts on how you graze, or what you do for extended grazing. Kind of what's the size and production stage of the animal? Is it a mature animal, or is it young stock that's a growing animal? I got a picture here of our wean calves in that same pasture that we saw before, that they're grazing some stockpile grass, and there's probably some red clover in there as well usually. And if it, is it a small animal, large animal? Is it a dry cow versus a lactating cow, or cow-calf pair out there? All that plays into how much nutrition that animal needs, and what kind of crops or quality you're going to need. So as I said, there's nutrition, the amount of water that you need, fencing durability, I called it. We've had different projects where we've taken wean calves and grazed into the fall, and livestock is no different than people. That it seems like when the kids are with their parents, they behave pretty well, but you take them away from their parents until they kind of learn what they got to do. They make some bad choices, and you can go out there with portable fence that we've had in areas, and the calves will behave and they'll be there for 3 days in a row, and you don't know what happened in the 4th day, but there are 4 sections over where they're supposed to be. They blew through the fences, whether something spooked them, lightning or a coyote or whatever it might be. And so that kind of plays into your effect, because it's never fun fixing fence and putting cattle back that have gotten out on you, or any other livestock for that matter. All right, so here's basically the same pasture in one of the projects that I was just talking about there. How quickly things can change. This was late November a few years ago. This is actually some of that Kernza, that perennial wheatgrass that I was talking about. We did a stockpiling and grazing of that, and relatively same pasture, and one day to the other we're 50 degrees and it was nice, and gonna change the weather like we've been having lately, and next thing you know, we've got 2 or 3 inches of snow. So kind of stockpile additional pasture. That's probably your simplest option. So again, do you have the additional pasture acres available? Sometimes they can be hard to come by, but if they are, maybe that's a good choice. Benefit is it's probably got fence and water access already, so you don't have to do something extra for that. And it's known that certain grass species hold quality better than others. We'll get into that in the next slide. And usually the grass will meet the animal nutrition needs of the animals without worries of other detriments. You're not gonna, not unless you got legumes that you might bloat, but you're not gonna have nitrates or prussic acid or things with your typical cool season grasses that we'd see. Another benefit is a perennial, so it'll be there year after year for you. It will benefit, like a lot of them, from extra nitrogen fertilizer if you can put that on. And really, you think about stockpiling extra pasture in the fall, but you can do it anytime. If you can get some extra acres, you can, even if it's a ways from home, you can if you can get your animals there and graze them during June, July, and August, and then come back and after you stockpile some at home or something like that. It can be anytime. It just doesn't have to be one certain November, December, or whatever month that might be. So in the mid to late 90s, they did a project, Dan Undersander in his lab at Lancaster, Arlington, and Marshfield. And this was under mechanical harvest conditions, so we didn't graze the cattle, but they took samples and analyzed quality and yield after frost in October, December, and again in March before the green up. And they had different fertilization rates, and one conclusion they came and found was that adding 60 pounds of nitrogen in August increased your yield of average on grass to about 1.24 tons versus 0.72 tons, and that was in that October harvest at frost time. So they did find yield decreased from October to December, and then again December to March, and they lost almost 50% of dry matter loss from October to March. So most of that came from December to March. But so for us here in the upper Midwest in Wisconsin, probably trying to carry that grass over to March, you can retain some, but you're going to lose quite a bit. And that's leaching from the carbohydrates and the wilted grass and things like that, where they lost that dry matter. So they researched 7 different cool season grasses, and I've got them ordered here in their performance. The best for stockpiling was tall fescue, not so good necessarily in the season as palatability would be, but its growth and somehow in that tall fescue, when it goes through a frost, it becomes more palatable and it just holds up better. It's a best grass usually we think of for cool season grasses for stockpiling. Then came the early maturing orchard grass and the late maturing orchard grass, timothy, canary grass, smooth brome grass. And the worst, they even had quackgrass that they tested, and that broke down fairly quick and really wasn't, if you have it, it's available, but there's better options there. So the risk with it was you can put your nitrogen on in August, but you need to have some moisture to help incorporate that and help the grass grow. Some years we get a lot of it, some years we don't. So there's you're dependent on that. And then also once you get into that November, December, how much snow and ice you get, how readily available you can get to it, and the cattle can graze it. So from their calculations, they estimated about 0.4 acres, just under a half an acre of pasture, would be able to graze one mature cow for a month. All right, crop residues. Corn stalks are most common in this area. As I said, there's some others, but I'll kind of focus on that because there's the most data and the easiest to find available. So for every bushel of corn, there's about 50 pounds of residue, and that includes leftover grain, the husks, leaves, cob, stalk, and kind of the quality level goes in that order. So cattle will selectively eat the best and then work their way down. So they'll start with that leftover grain and the husks and leaves, and if they get desperate, they'll go down to that cob and stalk that's lower quality. So in typical, they figure that the cow will eat about 25% of the total residue, and it's a lower in protein but moderate in energy. So a dry beef cow is a good fit for that. 5.5% crude protein and 55% TDN. But if you've got you might need to supplement usually some protein if you need on that for certain younger animals, or might not be enough protein even for some young beef cows or lactating beef cows, something like that. So this is kind of another uniformity for most of them. If the more you can fence them down, strip grazing or others will increase your efficiency and utilization. And on the opposite, if you get a lot of rain and mud, they're going to stomp that in, you're going to get less utilization. So University of Nebraska had a report that from their calculations, if you had a 1,200 pound beef cow, should have about 51 days of grazing on an acre of corn stalks with 180 bushel yield of corn. So, and if the yield goes down, you'll have less residue, or if it goes up, you might have more. And again, with the cow, if she's a heavier cow, if you've got bigger cows, they'd eat more, so you'd have more consumption and less days, or if you were smaller animals, that would go up. So, and in their report, they said they had no differences found for genetically modified corn plants. So if it was BT or Roundup Ready corn, the residue didn't make a difference for the cows. There's nutrition was the same, quality, yield, not much different. And the report commented that cattle can graze through several inches of snow. I think they used 5 or 6 inches of snow. They said beef cows can still graze stalks and be fine. Now the cows may not think so. They may tell you they need some extra hay or they don't want to graze through that, but they said they can maintain themselves and intakes are fine. But it's once you get over that amount that you might need to take them some supplement feed, as well as extreme weather if you get really cold. So with dry grazing conditions, the University of Nebraska said that you really wouldn't have any impact of yield effects in the future in the next year. But if you get wet, you can have some compactions and that can have lasting effects. And with only removing 25% of the forage, you're not going to have any erosion concern. There's enough cover there to protect, but it can be hard to establish the value of what those corn stalks are worth to you as an opportunity cost or renting them from the neighbor. And it's something that needs to figure out each year, because the value of the fertilizer like this year and high would change that. So again, fencing and watering to think of. All right, dormant alfalfa or hayfields may be another common and easy picture or easy source. I have a few sheep at home, and this is a hayfield, grass and clover hayfield that we graze late after we make some hay off of it during the summer. Can also be a source of high quality forage. You got to worry about that bloat with the legumes if it's not wilted after hard frost. So your timing is kind of critical there. Amount of residual is concerned for winter kill and erosion. Unlike the corn stalks, they'll eat everything to the ground. So you can reduce your cover too much and give yourself some problems. And you can have some winter kill, some damage to the plants if they get it grazed too short for icing and things like that. Wet conditions, they can punch it up and they could damage roots and weaken your stand, kill some of the plants out. And with alfalfa, you might have a tighter window for grazing. You want to wait till you're frost so you don't bloat, but yet you wait too long, then it can wilt too much and go down, and then they won't eat quite as much. So timing can be critical there. And as I said, we're more sensitive to wet conditions. So we'll get into the annuals and getting tight on time, so we'll keep rolling along. Brassicas, your turnips, radishes, rape, things we think of for a cover crop. Small grains fit in there well, oats, rye, etc. Grasses, as I said, annual ryegrass, teff grass, corn, sorghum stand, and then a variety of legumes you can utilize too. So in brassicas, seems like they're not as common here, maybe out west or different areas, but I found somewhere it said in Europe, they've been used for over 600 years and they're common, just not quite as common for us. Benefits of them, they're fast growing. They can graze in 45 to 60 days after planting, and you can regraze them, but some of them, and variable seeding dates. So you can plant in spring or late summer, you can graze in midsummer or in the fall, what have you. Animals, they can eat the vegetative tops as well as the bulbs in the turnips and the radishes. They have extremely high water content, so that can be a concern, limiting your intake. They're very high in protein and digestible nutrients, which is good, but they have a low amount of fiber, so they may need to be diluted down, and for mixing small grain can be good to balance that out. So they can be a concern for sulfur and nitrates. Nitrates usually pop up more during drought conditions. So that's something you want to watch. Sulfur toxicity in animals can cause a form of polio. It can be bad. They typically, brassicas have a higher rate than what's tolerable for animals, especially cattle is what I saw most reported. So that's something of concern. But again, if you plant it as a mix, which lots of times they do, like a small grain, that can dilute out that sulfur level of the total forage intake of the animal. So that can reduce your risk. So again, the small grains can help you with some fiber or other mixing in to increase the utilization. So that right down through the ruminant. And they can have a different taste and take a little bit to have an introduction period to get the animals adjusted to grazing on brassicas. They can have a little, just take a little bit till they get acclimated. Once they get acclimated, they'll be fine, but you just may need to stretch them onto that gradual. So again, like the other, you can increase with strip grazing your efficiency. It has all the different benefits that we talked about before with soil conservation and regeneration. And if you need to renovate a sacrifice pasture or an area, or if you hit some winter kill and forages, it can be an emergency forage plan to help you out that way. Small grains, they're a different plant, but they got a lot of similar qualities to the brassicas, how you treat them. They're fast growing, they can have variable planting dates. They can be regrazed if needed, if you hit them at the right stage. The difference in growth patterns, so if you plant oats is a common one. You plant it in the spring, you got to worry about heading out, and if it gets too late, it goes to boot stage, then you can only have one grazing or your quality goes way down. Where if you plant them in the fall, that typically doesn't go to seed quite as quick, and that can hold its quality better. So, your annual small grains will outproduce your winter rye, winter wheat in the fall season. So if you plant oats in winter rye or winter wheat, triticale, whatever, at the same time, you know, those winter biennial forages, they need that cold shock to get that big growth on them, where the oats or an annual, that'll keep growing in the same season. So that'll actually, you need to fit the right piece to the right situation that you need. So you can be an inexpensive forage option, and if you can't get it grazed, you still maybe can make it as a hay or baleage or something like that. So that's a good option too. And like the others, you can benefit from nitrogen. So other annual grasses that can be niche or more variety. They can be cooler, warm season. Sometimes I'm kind of talking about like teff grass and corn and sorghum Sudan grass. Sometimes they only have a single grazing, like grazing corn or other multiple grazings, and they can fit in that renovation emergency forage. They still have some toxicity concern and drought tolerance. So the corn and sorghum Sudan can be good for that. And they do have some frost sensitivity in late season, so you have to be aware of that. So we'll kind of go through these to get finished up here. Italian and ryegrass, very easy growing, easy seeding and fast growing. It's not drought tolerant, so it's not something you want to be grazing in the middle of July and August when it's super hot. That'll kind of shut down like your bluegrass will in your yards or in your pastures. It does need nitrogen, but it will respond well to that. It's a good quick cover. It can be regrazed quickly, sometimes even 14 to 21 days. You can go back on grazing that. It's not so good for mechanical harvest. It's got a nice fine leaf that's good for grazing, but by the time you try to make that, cut it, rake it, bale it, however, you can have troubles picking that up. So teff grass here's a picture that we grazed for a few years with some projects. It actually is a warm season grass from Africa, Ethiopia, I believe. And it can be regrazed. You gotta, one that you gotta wait until after frost and plant later May or maybe June. It's an annual, so you just one season. It can be grazed or made as hay. It's very good quality and palatability. They say of course they like it for hay, but we did well grazing the cows on it. It has a fine stem, so it can have some lodging. You can kind of see some of that where it got kind of tall on us and went down a little bit. And like with anything, if it lodges, the cattle may not want to eat it, or animals eat it as well. It does take nitrogen, and as I said, it will not survive frost, but can be a good fit for certain situations. And you're grazing corn and sorghum Sudan grass. This was a project that we had working extending grazing season on some pasture finished cattle. We had a group that just grazed cool season pasture all summer long. We had a group that from July and August, we tried to graze sorghum Sudan grass, and another group that grazed corn. But they're again warm season. Planting dates maybe a little bit later than some small grains and things like that. But these sure can grow fast if they get the right conditions. And they do take nitrogen. And there's a concern of nitrates in the dry weather and prussic acid and sorghum Sudan grass when you get a frost. So that's things you want to think about. And I say that with various with the grazings, whether it's a single or repeated times. So weather can make harvesting difficult. We had that project. We had a fall that had crazy amounts of rain. We had 3 and 4 inches a week, and boy, they sure tore that up, punched it into the mud, and didn't get near the efficiency in grazing. Even that sorghum Sudan grass, we had some plants kill out when we tried to do multiple grazings. So that can keep you out from grazing, and it gets way taller and less quality than what you want, or you can lose your efficiency if you get in there if it's too wet conditions. So it's things you got to think about. As I said, quality and harvesting efficiency is variable with how you manage it. Strip grazing helps the smaller sections you had. We had issues when we grazed the corn. The cattle got smart and knocked down the corn stalks on our break fences, so then they could get into the other parts. So we had to try to manage around that. And if you're grazing corn, I know when we were doing that about 10 years ago, the interest was in using bin run corn. But if you have conventional corn that might have Roundup Ready or BT genes in it, you got to watch your license restrictions so you don't get in trouble that way. Other annual legumes, there's lots of options. They're less common to be independent, but they can be part of mixtures that you use in different cover crops. And one other thing that I had that we've used, sometimes we'll clean out our seed and plant red clover or alfalfa into our sacrifice area in our winter area after oats. And even though they're perennials, we treat them as an annual. We use up some of that old seed, and we get some forage produced for the cows, and helps us use up some old seeds. So not necessarily high tech, but making the best of the situation that you have. All right, your biennials, your winter wheat, winter rye, triticale. Like I said, other parts of the U.S., higher quality forage. They have the benefit, they can give you late season or early season grazing. They can be regrazed. You can make them as a harvest forage if you need to. Benefits from nitrogen, and then sometimes with these you do need to terminate them, and you got to watch some of your restrictions and your herbicides of effects of what you're doing with that. All right, so here's our last one, intermediate wheatgrass or Kernza. So we started working with this 5 or 6 years ago. It's more of a grass, but it does produce a grain that you can harvest. Interesting part, like I said, it's a perennial, so it's the only main perennial grain that's out there, small grain. So interesting, and you can graze and harvest the grain, and then also 3-way you can harvest the forage residue after combining. That's a low quality hay, or we even used it as a bedding when we were short. But again, like the biennials, are early and late season, and it does require some nitrogen here. You might see a little bit of clover. We had some plots planted with red clover and some solo. So the limits on it, it's grain decreases in production after time. So since it's tends to be more of a grass, it will it will try to form that sod, and as it gets thicker, that's less green seed produced. So you get your best green yield in the first couple of years, and then it goes down after that. So since it's kind of a novelty and more of a research experimental, it can be difficult to source seed. You just can't go to any seed dealer and buy seed. You got to have a connection researcher from the university or somewhere else, and time sensitive on grazing in the spring. If you want to wait and let your yield get up as big as it can, but you don't want to get that grain or harm that grain production. So the grain harvest, the way it ripens, more out west, they do swath it and draper head, which is hard. So if you use a regular combine head, your grain has more variability in the moisture. It can take some extra management to get it market ready. So, and again, on the common market for grain sales, you just can't go to your elevator to sell it. You have to have a special market for it. It can be valuable, but you need to have a special market. So we're continuing with research, and some other research universities and places are as well. So it may need some more development, but it's an interesting topic or option to have as a niche market or a niche purpose for it. So, all right, I apologize to overrun a little bit, but a page of conclusions and we'll get on to questions. So as you can see, there's many different options. Unfortunately, like a lot of things, there's no silver bullets for all. Not one thing's going to work for everybody in every place. So you kind of go through the pros and cons and weigh out all your options. Utilize your resources, and not only your resources, your land, your equipment, but your networks or extension or NRCS, neighbors, find out what works and help evaluate your options and find the best fit for your operation. So you can match your options that fit your strengths and try to avoid your weaknesses or your dislikes. So find what fits. And the tough part is it may change from year to year. Maybe you'll have a system that you do several years in a row, and sometimes weather conditions change and what you did this year isn't what you need to do next year. So, alrighty. Thank you, and I'll send it back to the others to help with questions.
Yeah, thanks, Arin. That was a lot of information. Thank you, and very thorough. Really appreciate the depth that you went into there and learning so much about the research station too. I did not know that y'all did so much. So really great information. Thank you all for attending today. Thank you, Arin, for being willing to take the time out of your really busy schedule to share the expertise with us. And like we said, if anybody comes up with any questions, feel free to reach out directly to us. We're all about supporting education and outreach efforts around grazing. So thank you all. And like we said, there'll be a survey that pops up, so please take that. We look at those every time, and it helps us develop webinars. So we want to put on what you guys want to see and learn about. So please fill that out. And we will post the recording hopefully within the next week on the Pasture Project YouTube channel. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Arin. Thank you, Danny. And we'll see y'all next time.